Hello, my name is Daniel Simpson. It is 10 p.m. I am sitting in my kitchen in a pandemic in a lockdown, and I have only one question for you. Do you know where your model is? Today I'm going to talk about some, questionable things that we do and say to ourselves. A tenet of a lot of statistical education, if not necessarily statistical practice, is that when doing good, honest, real, proper statistics, you pre-specify a model and you only fit that model to the data once and perhaps validate it on a separate set of data, but you do not touch the data multiple times. Unfortunately, when I actually do statistics, it tends to look more like this. So this leads to kind of an important and challenging question. If I can't use the data twice, what happens when I use it 53 times? So the question, to put it slightly differently, is can we touch this? And the answer, I think, is yes. One of the things that we need to interrogate in order to be able to consider this problem is what does only using the data once actually give us? Well, it gives us some things. It gives us frequentist guarantees, whether we want them or not. It gives us easy access to asymptotic results, which are useful for reasoning about how a model should work and how a model will work. It's useful for designing computational schemes. And generally speaking, this idea of whether we're sending something to infinity or not, the idea of what happens as we get more data is a useful thing to know. It also provides some guards against overfitting the data. I would not say that it is a foolproof method to not overfit the data, because that's a lie. But it does provide some guards. What are the bad things? Well, it doesn't in any way, shape, or form guard against misspecification or otherwise underfitting your data. There's also no model checking or assessment without some corresponding loss of information, okay, by splitting the data or doing something like that. So it's not a free ride to get these frequentist guarantees that we may or may not want. But it is a nice, understood set of things that we can have. So if I touch the data more than once, if I iterate my model building by fitting a model, looking at some aspects of the fit, and then creating and constructing and refining my model, what can happen? Well, the bad things that can happen is that you could overdo the process and adapt your model to idiosyncratic aspects of the data that will tank generalizability, or to say it faster, because we've got 15 minutes, you could overfit. You could also, because of this, make decisions that would be massively different if you had seen more data or less data or different data. Okay, so inappropriate claims of discovery are one example of this, but really any sort of decision that isn't varying smoothly with the amount of data that you have is a problematic thing. And finally, two data analysts could get wildly different answers depending on the amount of time and effort and experience they had with fitting this sort of data. This, to be fair, happens in the other case as well, but let's talk about problems. So do these happen with single-use data? Yes, they do. Okay, nothing fixes your problem if you have misspecified your model, or if you have sort of misspecified your sampling mechanism, and therefore your data in small samples will produce estimates that replicate the complex sampling design, which is what you've asked it to do, but not necessarily the population that you care about. And of course, every single motivation for causal inference falls into this category of what else can go wrong even if you only touch the data once. So this brings us to an important question. What can we do about it? Well, a classical option here is to suck it and see, to say, this is my model, this is my prior, and therefore this is my posterior, and if you don't like it, you are more than welcome to construct your own. This is, of course, a great way to tell people to jog on. It is not necessarily infeasible in a context where this sort of thinking can be proven wrong quickly. So when you have a streaming data sort of situation, but it's quite a lonely road. I'm not sure that I would recommend it. But you see this a lot, especially at Bayesian conferences. Um, Option number two is to try and build some sort of complex model of an idealized process of this iterative model flow. Okay, and this would allow us to build new conditions under which we can answer the key questions, like what would happen if I had more data, and what sort of first order approximation can we get to the trade-off between accuracy by moving towards a better specified model for the data and overconfidence when we generalize, and in fact bias if you go so far as that, as we move through our model space from good models to bad models. The challenge with this is that this process of iterative model building is not necessarily linear. You don't go through a list of models in a straight line. There are branching points where you could make multiple decisions. It's also not easy to mathematize because if you think about how you really do this, you take a look at your residual plots and you go, oh, I forgot to group for country, and things like that. On top of that, the mathematical tools are going to be specialized because, let's face it, we have put some sort of dependence in the Bayesian updating process, and that doesn't seem like a thing that is going to come out cleanly. So the third option that we have, of course, is to try and understand and build a model for a Bayesian workflow. Okay? A Bayesian workflow is the whole process of building from an initial model to a final outcome. There are essentially three pillars of Bayesian workflows. These are the model specification initially, the computation, and the model interrogation and extension, which is really about how you look at the outcome of your computation and work out whether your model's beautiful just the way it is, or whether it needs to have another layer of development, and what that layer of development should look like. Computation has not traditionally been a part of these conversations, but I would argue that it's a vital part because it acts as a limit to both the types of models that we can investigate and how well the results that we actually looked at when performing interrogation and extension actually correspond to the model that we thought we were fitting. And that, as you have big or complex data, as you have big or complex models, becomes a real issue. So Bayesian modeling is not just slow, it's also complicated. Really selling it there, aren't I? So this sort of thinking is not new. I mean, the person that you always point at is George Box, but there have of course been a bunch of others. It's got 3 Box things, including a really cool talk on YouTube. But of course, there's been a number of people who have thought about this in the context of exploratory data analysis. There are also models of software development. Like whether you should waterfall or cascade, or whether you should spiral towards a solution. We spiral because we're dramatic people. There's also more recent work on this, in particular work that exists in the data science workflow area. There's also work in sort of visualization and various other places. We have a paper, it has references. I recommend them. The reality is that like these box models, of course, look very pretty, and you can definitely put those in a textbook or in a sort of a set of slides or an introductory Bayesian course, and no one's going to like have a small sort of panic attack. Unfortunately, when you try and do it in any sort of modern setting, and in particular when you take into account all of the complexities and idiosyncrasies that come about when you have to deal with computation and difficult computation and approximate computation and all of those things, you discover very quickly that the spiral makes you perhaps want to spiral yourself. There are a number of aspects of things going on here, um, where you have to fit the models, validate your computations, evaluate your models or fix your computations, modify your models if it's not enough, compare models if you've gone down multiple branches and found different ways of doing this. And it really comes down to the fact that we're all doing this with the same set of data. And so this is really a question that we have. Does this work? We actually think it does, because essentially it's a fairly successful way and a fairly common way to do statistical modeling. And it only really becomes alarming when you write down all of the details. There are questions about how we should do this, what we should do to make this safer. Is there a way that we can do clever data splitting that allows us to split in the knowledge that the structure of our data, which should be guiding the way that we build test and training sets, is an uninformed and unknowable thing at the moment? Are there ways to do clever, or possibly even unclever, bootstrap type things? Do we have an ability to make a heuristic that says something about when and how much we can adapt our model? If you think about it, you realize that the further you are along the spiral process towards the best model that you're going to get, the larger the barrier towards adapting the model should be, and the smaller the adaptations should be. So, for instance, it may not hurt you in the initial step to look at changes that are due to like a couple of data points, like a couple of outliers. You look and think, oh, all of those points are in Mongolia. We've done something wrong with Mongolia. And then you change your model in some appropriate way, and you find out that by fixing the problem that was manifesting in Mongolia, you have improved a whole sort of bunch of your model. So these sorts of things can happen early on in the process, but later on you can imagine that it would be deeply dangerous to try and adapt to to sort of single observations or single residuals, or really anything that isn't wildly dramatic. Okay? You can do all kinds of things. I guess like you could find some sort of criterion, like an expected log predictive density, and try and find an elbow in it, or going through seeing if you are making large progress or small progress. You need to balance how much was added to the model versus how much your model has gained from it. And we really do need to think about how we should formulate this framework, and then what sort of questions are the correct theoretical questions to ask about it. Because most of the battle, well, I was going to say most of the battle is the question, but that's not true. Most of the battle is finding the version of the question that you can do something with. But we do believe that this framework for thinking about Bayesian modeling as an iterative process that goes through this sort of cycle is the thing that we need to focus on as we move forward into our further theoretical and practical understanding of how statistics is done in practice. It's worth saying that we have abandoned all frequentist guarantees, but I don't care.